Bill, first, you have done what I think many in our audience yearn to do, which is you got to know Europe and France and learned French. How did that happen for you?
Well, it was a strange and circuitous route. I went to university in Oregon on a basketball scholarship. When I graduated, I was drafted by the San Francisco Warriors in the NBA. And but unfortunately, my skills were too limited, and I was cut by the team shortly after during the first year. And my agent said, "Well, you can go to Europe and play." And I said that sounded like a new adventure. I'd never been there. And one thing led to another, and I ended up spending 7 fabulous years roaming around Europe, Italy, Spain, France, and then in Belgium, where I also did my graduate studies. So it was a wonderful introduction to Europe. Ended up marrying a Belgian woman who became a career diplomat, and I learned French with her, and helped me throughout my career when I was serving as the Washington Post bureau chief in Paris for 6 years.
And after that very distinguished career, you gained enough access to Macron to write this book. Can you tell us how that came about?
Yeah, I was very intrigued to learn that he had enjoyed my previous book, which is called Fractured Continent, Europe's Crises and the Fate of the West, which is sort of a panoramic look at the crises of the past 10 years in Europe, seen from 12 different capitals, where had been traveling frequently during my time as chief European correspondent for the Washington Post. And also through some mutual friends, including Francois Delattre, who was then the UN ambassador to the United Nations, and Yves-André Estel, the head of Rothschild in North America. So one thing led to another. When we finally met, he was here on a state visit, and we had a good rapport. I told him I wanted to concentrate on his vision of the world, and particularly his unusual relationship with Donald Trump at the time. And during the course of our conversations, I came to be quite impressed by his breadth of thinking and the amount of reading and that he had done about history and literature and philosophy. He really has a philosophical turn of mind. And at a time when we were in America experienced a controversial presidency that was quite anti-intellectual, he was a refreshing figure to focus on.
Can you give us a bit of a sense of what it's like to spend time with him? What is he like as just a person?
Well, I think, as has been mentioned, his flaw is he's perceived as arrogant and rather aloof, but in fact, in person, he's quite charming and very incisive, extremely intelligent and well-read, as I said. And I think that it's that contrast which is striking. But I was really with the fascination in terms of building a narrative to make it a good book was how does a political neophyte, never been elected to public office in the past, handle a difficult task like the presidency of France, and at the same time he set for himself an agenda which seemed nothing short of Herculean: modernize France, invigorate Europe, and reshape the world order. And for a 39-year-old inexperienced politician, I thought this would be fascinating to chronicle how the ups and downs of his presidency as he tried to move ahead with this incredibly daunting agenda.
Let's just rewind a bit and ask, what kind of a person is it? What path did he follow to finally get to the point where he's elected president at 39? Where does this guy come from?
Well, as you said, he grew up in the northern industrial town of Amiens. He fell in love with his high school drama teacher, and it's proved to be more than just an adolescent crush, because he kept, his parents sent him away to, they were both doctors, and Since the town was somewhat scandalized by this relationship, they sent him away to Paris to study in schools there, and he kept coming back practically every weekend to nurture this relationship, and finally ended up marrying her. So this was clearly the most important relationship in his life. But intellectually, I think what was significant was his 2 years that he spent as a research assistant with the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who helped shape his political thinking. And he came out of that with a view that a politician needs to be judged on what he actually achieves. And so he became really an uber pragmatist, an ultra realist. And that has shaped his approach to the presidency. Secondly, when he had served as deputy chief of staff to Francois Hollande, he was distressed by the paralysis in French politics, the fact that Hollande and Sarkozy and other presidents had tried to modernize France, including Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who just passed away, tried to push the country toward modernization and never succeeded. And he was willing to take on this task as we've seen, with some great controversy. But he felt it's absolutely needed in order to get France to play a role in the world as at the head of Europe.
His relationship with Hollande seems to be very typical Macron. He finds a powerful older man, flatters him into thinking that the older man is the mentor. And then when the older man, so Hollande makes him economy minister very young. Then when the older man has served his purpose, Macron sort of stabs him in the back, betrays him, runs for president, and discards him. And this has happened with a series of his older mentors.
Yes, I think he is something of a notorious seducer in terms, and I don't mean that in a sexual sense, more intellectual. And he certainly impressed Hollande with his intellectual prowess, his dynamism, his determination to really transform France at a time that it was really stuck in this paralyzed morass with a weak economy and sagging much behind Germany as the leader of Europe. But frankly, I've become cynical enough, I suppose, watching politicians over the years to realize that's standard practice. You can even—
he does it very well.
You can even make the same point about Angela Merkel, whose mentor was Helmut Kohl. And in the end, she ended up stabbing him in the back and taking over control of his party.
Indeed, we have a video actually that beautifully encapsulates Macron's mix of charm and intellect. Pamela, I wonder if you could show us that one.
Elysées, moi.
Ah, vous voulez faire Alsace maintenant?
J'ai toujours fait Elysées.
Vous ne cessez de vous contredire. Je vous laisse, on a une page.
This is where the journalist comes up to him and says, you played Molière at high school, a Molière play. How about you take some time and revise it? I'll come back to you later and we'll act it together. And Macron says, no, let's act it together right away. And so this is—
Et on tease, tous les téléspectateurs attendent. Vous le faites maintenant? Alors allons-y. Qu'est-ce donc avez-vous?
Laissez-moi, je vous prie.
Encore, dites-moi, quelle bizarrerie.
Laissez-moi là, vous dis, j'ai couru vous cacher.
Mais on entend les gens au moins sans se fâcher.
Moi, je veux me fâcher, ne veux point entendre.
Dans vos brusques chagrins, je ne puis vous comprendre. Et quoi, Camille, enfin, je suis tout des premiers.
Moi, votre ami? Rayez cela de vos papiers. J'ai fait jusqu'ici profession de l'être, mais après ce qu'en vous je viens de voir paraître, je vous déclare net que je ne le suis plus et ne veux nulle place en des cœurs corrompus.
Je suis donc bien coupable, Alceste, à votre compte?
So this is spontaneous acting out of a scene from Molière that he remembers from years ago. So he does enormous amounts of reading, also because he wakes up before anyone else, right? He sleeps less than anyone else, and he spends 90 minutes each morning reading, I gather, from your book.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he sleeps 3 and 4 hours a day. And I don't know where he gets all this energy, but it's he certainly is, I think, an autodidact. I during the course of working on this book, I kept asking, did he have a mentor in international affairs, someone like Raymond Aron, who taught him all this? And everybody responded, no, he's really self-taught. He does a lot of reading, does a lot of thinking, and the way he conducted foreign policy was really through personalities, interacting with Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Angela Merkel, Xi Jinping, and really hoping that, I guess, his seductive qualities would help him achieve what he was looking for.
We'll get to Trump later, but he has that mix of his own path, but also the French establishment path. So he goes to the most elite school, the school where presidents go to, the ENA, École Nationale d'Administration. So he's on the traditional path, but he also then founds his own party as a vehicle for his presidential campaign. Tell us about that kind of curious mix of styles that he has.
Well, it was that was really the fascinating turn in his career, that he had been brought in to the Elysées by Hollande as a socialist, and the thinking was that, okay, he would follow the line of Michel Rocard, a moderate socialist who wanted to modernize the economy. But he was so frustrated by the inability of the government to push through these reforms that he started thinking more and more, well, maybe the traditional left-right establishment is obsolete. And that's where he came up with the idea of La République en Marche, creating a party, a movement, as he said at the time, that would really capitalize on the frustrations of the French people with the political establishment, that he felt was tired, worn out, that the traditional ideological divide between left and right no longer applied to the problems of the 21st century. And we're discovering that here in the United States very belatedly, but I think that prescription is accurate when you look at issues like pandemics and climate change. So I think it was really his desire to disrupt and eventually destroy the political establishment that led him to create this party and generate a lot of enthusiasm among people in France who were had become disappointed and disgusted with politics.
And he frames the election as a choice in the end between open to the world or closed to the world. He is open to the world, and Marine Le Pen, who is his opponent in the second round, French far-right leader, is closed to the world. And this seems, just after Trump and Brexit, to kind of encapsulate the moment we were in, didn't it?
Well, that's right. And again, this is a reflection of how he has learned through the period of his presidency. That was very, very accurate at the time. In fact, across Europe and even indeed North America, the United States, that there was a division between those who believed in an open global economy. The forces of globalization are irresistible and we have to cope with them and adapt to them. And those who wanted to retreat within national borders behind a nostalgic view of the world that could no longer really work. But now I think it's interesting how his views have changed, as have other leaders, that Europe really needs and France needs a strong state to survive these challenges posed by the post-pandemic world.
So in this marvelously dramatic situation, he's elected president. Pamela, I wonder if you can show us the video of that first night when his inauguration, which he has staged like he stages everything at the Louvre.
Et que souhaite Emmanuel Macron, qui devient donc à 39 ans le plus jeune président de la République. C'est un moment effectivement assez solennel de cet homme aujourd'hui seul dans cette cour, un moment que vous vivez en direct sur France 2.
On est dans les symboles, on est clairement dans les symboles européens, puisque c'est l'hymne à la joie qui sert d'hymne européen qui accompagne ce mouvement d'Emmanuel Macron. Symbole mitterrandiste évidemment, avec cette marche en solitaire, cet éclairage et cette mise en scène très soignée. Ce sont des images fournies par l'équipe du candidat. Emmanuel Macron marche symboliquement vers son destin. Il marche vers ce peuple de France qui l'attend, qui attend son discours Voilà, on se disait que cette première soirée de président pour Emmanuel Macron serait riche de signes et de symboles. Il y a eu ce premier discours sur un ton de gravité, sans aucun triomphalisme. Il y a maintenant cette arrivée sur cette esplanade du Louvre, la main levée pour saluer, seul, comme peut l'être, comme peut-être seul l'est un président. Laurent.
So he takes over, and as you say, he has this project to modernize France. Can you briefly explain what that means? France is stuck because its labor market makes it difficult to hire and fire. What else does it mean, and what does he want to do about this?
Well, I think he wanted to liberate the talents of young French people, especially. He felt that the state controlled too much of the economy. Indeed, when he took over, I think France, 57% of the economy was in state hands. He said, we need to reduce that down into the lower 40s. And so what he wanted to do was encourage more entrepreneurial efforts. Xavier Niel became who was a high tech entrepreneur, became one of his favorite examples. But he also was aware of the fact that in places like Silicon Valley, where I grew up, there are as many as 80,000 young French people who had migrated from France to work there because they're well trained in mathematics. They found jobs easily in Silicon Valley, but they were badly needed in France. He wanted to draw these people back. The same in London. There were, 300,000 French people who had emigrated to London, and he wanted to bring all of this talent back as a way of showing France had changed. And the first way he wanted to do that, of course, was to change the labor laws, make it more attractive for foreign investment. He courted high-tech entrepreneurs, wanted to make Paris the most desirable place to live for the world's greatest researchers. So there was this flurry of activity in his first months, trying to generate a buzz about Paris, about France, that would attract a lot of foreign investment and jumpstart the economy.
And he did actually change the labor laws in a more radical way than many people had expected, than many people had thought possible. Because in France, the main opposition is always from the street. Usually the president, his party controls parliament, but the problem is that whenever they do something, there are strikes. So the street can stop action. He did manage to reform labor laws. He did cut spending at the National Railway, which is a very big deal. You outline that very well in your book. But he also does something else right at the beginning of his term that comes back to bite him later. He cuts the wealth tax. Can you talk about that and the kind of impact that that has?
Well, that was a way of recognizing the fact that the wealth tax had become counterproductive, that it actually was not generating revenue from the richest people in France, that they were simply move their resources or move themselves over to Switzerland or somewhere else and escape the wealth tax. And he realized that we need to bring this capital back to France. And that's why he thought that the wealth tax was counterproductive. And so he got rid of it. But he was warned by several of his economic advisors that, look, this is going to make you appear very cold and heartless and like a ruthless capitalist. And indeed, that was the case, that he became saddled with the nickname, the president of the rich. And this has dogged him from the start of his presidency. He's tried to make changes but it really has not affected the public perception of him, that he's too friendly and too cozy with the wealthiest sectors of society.
We'll get back to that perception of the Président des Riches, but the other big project he has at the beginning of his reign is to charm Donald Trump. He sees another older man who is a prime seduction target for him. And so he sets about it. Can you talk about that very bizarre relationship that they build up?
Yes, well, I thought it was quite striking because they are totally antithetical personalities. I mean, Macron is a thoughtful, really philosophical mindset. Trump is just a cold-hearted businessman who thinks only in terms of what's the best deal he can cut for himself. But Macron recognized that he needed to show that he could lead Europe to have a productive relationship with this erratic leader of the United States, and that if the transatlantic partnership was going to continue, they had to find a way to work with Trump. So he focused on their similarities, the fact that they were both mavericks who destroyed the political establishment. They believed in the value of the private sector working with government as a way of getting things done. And so he used his seductive charms to flatter and impress Trump, and he became known as the Trump whisperer among other European leaders for his ability to soothe and somehow contain Trump. And that has been relatively the case, although it has not produced much in terms of policy changes. I recount how their first meeting, which Macron had carefully orchestrated and prepared, was in the Oval Office. And he thought he had a very sound strategy, which indeed is probably the strategy that Joe Biden is thinking of right now in terms of how Europe and the United States must work together to contain China. And he was going in and saying, we need to harness the power and resources of the United States and Europe together if we hope to cope with this rising superpower in China. And he was immediately interrupted by Trump and said, what the hell do you mean? He said, Europe is much worse than China. Look how Germany is ripping us off with their car sales and all of this. And Trump was totally taken aback. I mean, Macron was taken aback by Trump's outburst. And this made him realize it was going to be difficult. And sure enough, he did not convince him to stay in the Iran nuclear deal. He did not persuade him to remain within the Paris climate change accords. So all of these difficulties made life problematic for Macron and his efforts to further the transatlantic partnership.
Bill, just in terms of the relationship between Trump and Macron, I always had the impression, and I think people in France had the impression, that Macron was just sort of faking it, his closeness with Trump, in order to, as you say, seduce him and get what he wanted. But you suggest in your book that they actually had a real rapport, that they actually liked each other.
Well, I thought, early on it was in their relationship that there's this feeling that we were both elected, never having held office before. We do share these similarities of perspectives, and maybe we can work together in finding a useful partnership. For example, on Russia. Now, Trump has been accused of having these cozy relationships with Putin, but Macron also realized, look, we're not getting anywhere in terms of imposing sanctions on Russia. We need to find a way to talk with our adversaries. And indeed, the same approach to China. Macron shared the view that you need to take a tough approach to China, otherwise China will continue to exploit the West and not abide by the rules of the game. And this is the message that he spelled out on his own first trip to China. So in terms of the world, there are several areas where there is a meeting of the minds between them.
You said in your book that Trump was fascinated that they were both 24 years of age difference from their spouses, just in different directions. That's right. Well, that was a personal point of view that he had in terms of the age, and he said that this was an unusual coincidence that brought them closer together, and Macron was willing to accept it if that would help his relationship with Trump.
So he's struggling to make any headway with Trump. He struggles for a long time to make any headway with Germany. He has this desire for a more unified Europe with a kind of central government of the Eurozone. We won't go into that right now. What I want to come back to is in France, he starts to struggle with the population. We talks about the wealth tax, where people were paying, if you had over 1.5 million euros, I think you paid a percentage of your wealth to the state every year. So the rich had fled, he cuts the wealth tax, becomes known as the Président des riches. And then he starts to acquire also this reputation, arguably deserved, for arrogance. And Pamela, I think you have a video where he confronts this boy who addresses him as Manu, addresses him casually as Manu.
Bonjour, ça va? C'est bien? Ben, ça va? Je la connais, ça va Manu? Non, je suis pas ton copain, non. Voilà, tu es là, dans une cérémonie officielle, tu te comportes comme il faut. Donc tu peux faire l'imbécile, mais aujourd'hui c'est la Marseillaise et le chant des partisans, tu m'appelles Monsieur le Président de la République ou Monsieur. D'accord? Voilà, c'est bien. Et tu fais les choses dans le bon ordre. Si le jour où tu veux faire la révolution, tu apprends d'abord à avoir un diplôme et à te nourrir toi-même. D'accord? Et à ce moment-là, tu iras donner des leçons aux autres.
So he acquires his reputation for lecturing French people. He also lectures a gardener about how he should just cross the road to find work, etc. And so can you talk about how he comes to be seen by a large part of the population?
Well, I think those images, show that they reinforce the view that he was arrogant and distant. It's interesting how he started out with the nickname Jupiter, that he was trying to float above the clouds as the god of gods and stay out of daily politics. And that only contributed to the perception of arrogance. What he was doing was trying to channel the successful ploy of Francois Mitterrand, who often disappeared during times of crises when he was under a lot of criticism. And his staff would say, oh, the president has retreated to think big thoughts about the future of the world. And then he would come back, and then people were impressed by the fact that this was the way to govern. And he would use, most important of all, he would use his prime ministers as a shield for the criticism. And that's why he was able to cast them off after they had used up their utility for him. And I think this is where Macron has made perhaps a tactical error, in that he became too much associated with every minor detail as a micromanager president, which is not the way the French like it. And when he once complained to Mitterrand's former chief of staff that how can I be Jupiter and then at the same time manage the policies of the government, he said, I'm also saddled with the fact that with social media, people are looking at me 7 days a week, 24 hours, and images like that with young people, where he lectured him about calling him Manu, is something that never would have caught Mitterrand off guard.
So in 2018, driven partly by social media, he faces the biggest uprising of his presidency, the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, who come from rural France or ex-urban France. Can you talk about that and who they are and how that impacts his presidency?
Well, it was, when you look at the details of how this originated, nobody saw this rebellion in the streets coming. And it followed a policy of putting a small tax on diesel fuel as a way of encouraging people to move toward less polluting vehicles. This seemed like a sensible and sound green policy, yet it became seen as such a financial burden for people in the rural areas of France who needed to travel, use their car to travel half hour, 45 minutes to their jobs and back, and that this was going to be yet another tax burden that they would have to bear, whereas people living in the cities benefit from public transport and other benefits. So that they were the ones who were being forced to bear these costs. And Macron belatedly realized this is true, that when he retreated after the first wave of protests behind the walls of the Elysées, because his security guards were genuinely fearful that he was going to be assaulted by the fury of these public protests. He really fell into something of a depression. He was not seen for about 3 weeks. behind the walls of the Elysées and was trying to figure out how he could salvage his presidency, and came up with this view about Le Grand Débat National, where he would travel around the country doing these town hall meetings, which he did for about 3 months, and subjected himself to humiliating confrontations with the public, and staying on his feet for as long as 7 hours at each of these sessions.
In tiny libraries and gymnasia around the country where people would complain about how a local road had been not completed on time.
Yeah, and he had mastered the details of all this. He had answers for all of them, and this impressed a lot of the public, that he had actually prepared for each of these town meetings that he was doing, and this helped, I think, defuse these protests somewhat. And I had one of my interviews with him, I think it was in late February of 2019. So really about 3 months after, he was about a month and a half into these town hall meetings that he was doing, and they were showing signs of progress. And I said, what has surprised you the most about your first 2 years as president? And he leaned back in his chair and thought for about 10 seconds, and he just said, the hatred, la haine. And that has, even when you disagree with my views, I'm willing to hear you out on this, but I'm not prepared to be assaulted and attacked in such vitriolic terms as your president. And I think this is what really shocked him to the core.
So we just come out of the gilets jaunes. He then tries to reform pensions, he tries to reform transport workers, and there are huge strikes again. Just when that ends, the pandemic descends. France has had a very similar number of deaths to the US during the pandemic as a proportion of its population. Can you talk a bit about how he has handled the pandemic?
Well, I think they, like other European leaders, initially, once they were scrambling to find a national solution, they realized this could only be solved on a European level. And I think he's had achievements and setbacks in this regard. One, he managed to convince Chancellor Merkel and other leaders that Europe could fall apart unless they reached agreement on a massive recovery plan that would not overload the poorer countries with debts, but rather provide grants to them, kind of like a fiscal transfer from the rich countries to the poor. And
especially helping Italy and Spain.
That's right. And Germany had been resisting this time and time again, ever since the debt crisis 10 years ago. And finally, Merkel relented because she realized that the economic nationalist policies of the rich countries like Germany were becoming self-defeating, that if Italy and Spain and other southern debtor countries would collapse, this would be suicidal for Germany's economy. So Macron finally persuaded her that this was what needed to be done, but it took 3 years of arguments. But in terms of the public hospitals being ready to deal with the extent of the pandemic, I think that came as a shock to him. This didn't necessarily happen on his watch. The inability to make enough masks and provide the sufficient health care. But later on, I think the pressure to lift the lockdowns was so great that they did it too soon. And when the summer vacation period happened, now we've seen the second wave come roaring back, and it's been costly to the economy. But how he recovers from this, with France's economy shrinking about 10% this year, will be absolutely crucial to determining whether he can get reelected in 2022. But he is, as I've shown through the gilets jaunes and other challenges, he's remarkably resilient and persistent. The way he came back from the gilets jaunes challenge was something that very few other leaders could have done.
Yeah, we come to you live from Paris, where all the restaurants are closed, where the number of tourists has been close to zero for several weeks now, where a lot of businesses, like everywhere in the world, are worrying about disappearing forever. So he will have a lot to deal with as this ends. Last couple of questions from me, but if anyone else has questions, please post them on chat and we will try and get to them in a moment. What balance would you draw up of his presidency so far? What big successes, what big failures?
Well, I would say in terms of outlining what needs to be done, both for France and also for Europe, in terms of a plan to stand up to the other big power in this era of resurgent big power rivalry, where Europe can carve out its own place on the world stage, dealing with the United States, Russia, and China. I thought he's been remarkably effective and articulate, and in fact has been really ahead of others, of other leaders in diagnosing Europe's ills and France's problems and what needs to be done about them. But in terms of persuading the French people and persuading other European leaders to execute this plan and really undertake a certain amount of painful sacrifice in order to achieve things for the future, he's fallen short, and I think he would say so himself. And whether that's a knock on his ability to, maybe he has overestimated his skills at seducing or persuading the public, but this has become a regular disappointment for him.
There's a question from Helen Drake, who's an academic who does very good work on France. She says, let's have a thought experiment. Macron chooses not to run in 2022. Maybe he gets a world leadership role, let's say at the UN or the IMF. What would the French presidential contest in 2022 look like? You might have a more popular, let's say, liberal or centrist candidate, Edouard Philippe, or Anne Hidalgo coming from the left with Greens. Is there somebody else who might be better able to resist the far left and the far right in the next election?
Well, I think that's what there would be a rush to fill that vacuum in the center if he was not to run again. Edouard Philippe would be one natural choice, but when you look at the polls, you see that there's a popularity surge for green policies, but there hasn't been a charismatic candidate to step forward from on the left or from the green movement. So that could still happen. It could, because the Macron phenomenon happened with a suddenness that shocked the country and the political establishment back before the 2017 election. So the same thing could happen in the next year or so, particularly if the economy has difficulty recovering from the pandemic.
Yeah, maybe the Greens are the next new political movement, and Anne Hidalgo leading a socialist green coalition, that's one possibility. She's very charismatic. We have questions from Christine Jones and Julie Alport that I want to combine. Christine asks, how can one make any changes in France, given that people take to the streets, they strike and nothing changes? And Julie asks, why do the French seem to love to hate their presidents, or at least their modern presidents?
Well, I think it is going to require somebody with oratorical skills and the ability to come across on television and social media as a sympathetic but forceful leader who can persuade the French people that you need to change, that you have to give up this stubborn resistance about sticking with old habits because the world is moving on. And if France is going to achieve greater prosperity and peace within its fragmented society, it's going to have to adapt in many different ways. But every time he embarks on a reform project, you can be as logical as possible. For example, changing the educational system. He was impressed by Michel Rocard, who I interviewed before he died about the need to change, adapt the system so that people graduate from school, do one career, and then go back to school in their 40s or early 50s and learn another career, because as lifespans are growing longer, people need to realize they'll do 3 or 4 or 5 different careers in their lifetime, and that the education system has to adapt to this. So we're not seeing these changes because people are afraid of something new. And that force, that powerful force is particularly strong in France. I'm sorry, the second part of the question was?
Yeah, why are presidents, I mean, so disliked typically? Hollande at one point had approval ratings of 4%. 4% of the population approved of him. Sarkozy was not much more popular. Actually, Macron at nearly 50% approval rating is doing pretty well for a French president.
Yeah, he's gone back up to 50% at the height of the protests, gilets jaunes. He was down in the low 20s. So you can bounce back. No, I think it goes back. As he said, it's. He's grown rather cynical toward that. I think my last interview with him, he was saying, well, the French, we have a revolutionary history, and they love nothing better than to turn on their leaders when things go wrong. As we see, they want, and, if necessary, they want to attack them and kill them. And, that's why these depictions of him, mock images, effigies of Macron being led to the guillotine is perfectly in line with that view that the French are still marked by their revolutionary past.
Yeah, in fact, the two moments in French history that every French person grows up with are the revolution and then the resistance in World War II, which are both the people rising up, or in the Second World War, not all of them rising up, against an unjust regime. And so that is constantly acted out on the streets. But I want to come to a question from Kathy about Islam, about the education of imams. This has become a big issue since the beheading of a school teacher who had shown cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad to his school class a few weeks ago. So what is Macron trying to do about this, and why have so many of your colleagues in the US media criticized him about it?
Yeah, I think there's a misunderstanding on the part of Americans about the nature of laïcité, the separation between religion and the state in France, and the multiculturalism that we have tried here in the United States and has been tried in other European countries and not worked. Macron's big concern is really what he sees as the shifting behavior on the ground, that it's one thing for somebody to have tolerance and respect for the religion of others when it comes to not eating pork, or saying prayers 5 times a day, and in doing activities that don't affect others. But it's another thing when you are being asked in a separate community to accept polygamy, the mutilation of young girls, and these sort of challenges. Even as was shown in Germany, when Chancellor Merkel declared an end to multicultural policies, honor killings, when the daughters and sisters of that fathers and brothers of young Turkish German girls were actually killing them for dating German men. I mean, this sort of thing is intolerable in a Western society. You can't say that, well, we need to allow this, respect the different cultural identity. You have to respect the laws of the society. So I think the challenges that we're seeing with Islam, because France has more Muslims than any other country in Europe, are particularly pronounced. He's given a lot of thought to that before he made his speech in early October. He'd spent almost 3 years considering what needed to be done. He reviewed everything that had happened. I remember in the 90s, Mitterrand tried this idea of homegrown imams, that they were going to be trained in France and then licensed to speak in the mosques. But it's been overwhelmed by funding coming from abroad, mainly Saudi Arabia, which has a more radical sect of Islam and has been shown to radicalize much of
and Turkish imams as well. But apart from the substantial issues which are real to do with some places where there is a kind of separatism from some, sorry, I gather I've frozen on the other screen. I was just saying, to what degree is Macron and many liberals in France, let's say, worried that Marine Le Pen could win the next presidential elections, and therefore he is covering himself on the right flank vis-a-vis seeming to be tough on Islam and seeming also to be tough on immigration and refugees?
Sure. Now, it's a classic political tactic when you recognize that the majority of voters are to your right. In this case, center-right and far-right voters in France, and that your challenge is coming from that. You want to prevent your opponent from gaining that majority. You're going to follow policies that you think that are supported by the majority of the people, and I think getting tough on law and order is a classic move, and it's generally seen as popular and by the French public. I think where this recent controversy over the latest law to protect the police was very poorly written, and it's going to be redrafted, but which I think was the right thing to do. Withdraw it quickly, rework it in such a way that it's much more effective, and that will, I think, diffuse the protests. I think Macron is realizing that he learns from his mistakes, and this is one case where he may come out of it better than before.
Last question from me. We have a new US president coming in, although not everybody believes it. And he also has a Secretary of State who is a Parisian, Tony Blinken. Can you talk about Biden and Blinken and how this will help or not Macron's presidency?
Sure. Well, I think there's great hope for the Biden administration, and I know Tony Blinken rather well, and he'll be a terrific Secretary of State. His understanding of the world and his convictions that the transatlantic partnership should be the essential foundation for American foreign policy are very encouraging. I think what I'm impressed by is that the Biden administration realizes that while Germany may be the most powerful country economically in Europe, France is the key player in terms of strategic considerations. France, with Britain's exit of the EU, France will be the dominant military power in Europe. It's been willing to send its soldiers abroad in the Sahel to battle the Islamic State with the support of the United States. And I think that will continue. And more importantly, I think with the shifting strategy in the United States, everybody is talking about what can be done to contain China. And one of the priorities of the Biden administration will be an Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think there, the fact that France has more than 1 million of its citizens living in that vast oceanic region, and that it has considerable naval resources to draw upon, France could end up being the most valuable military and strategic partner for the Biden administration in the years to come.
Bill, thank you very much from me. I'm